So, organizational impact. Um, the power within an organization comes from the centrality as opposed to title. And so, there's something called the diffusion of innovations theory, and that's that social networks uh, play a very big role in influencing the spread of new ideas and practices. And so, this is where we get into this idea of influencers. The thing is, if you don't have this good spread, what will typically happen is that social systems denigrate into tribalism, something we see in our country right now. Uh, and Silicon Valley, so many groups have tried to emulate it, but the fundamental failure that they uh, didn't recognize in the Valley is if there was a president, there would never would have been a Silicon Valley. And that's that it came from the people naturally forming groups and having shared interests, and it formed on its own. So this is why they keep talking about ecosystem, that you can't force a network, that a network needs to grow on its own. What you're trying to do is build an atmosphere so that it will want to grow. And so this is the limitation of hierarchy, that you don't get the spread. Uh, for those of you who don't know the story of Silicon Valley, uh, Fred Terman of Stanford was a very big um, catalyst in all of this. He encouraged Stanford students to go out and become entrepreneurs. Actually, in the 1960s, Stanford was a cow college. It's not the powerhouse that it is today. And so William Shockley, the Nobel Prize winner, was a total SOB. Uh, he founded Fairchild Semiconductor, and he picked out 8 brilliant people, and they all quit on him. Maybe it's because he was bugging his employees' telephone lines. But from Fairchild Semiconductor, these 8 people went out and they caused a boom. Some of the people in there went on to form the first VC firms. Uh, Bob Noyce founded Intel, and so subsequently, all these people knew other people, and 71% of the companies in Silicon Valley can trace their lineage back to this Big Bang effect. You can also see these kind of patterns in inventions, that you have inventors and co-inventors, and they inspire other people, and this is the way patents are supposed to work. You're supposed to top each other. So when you look at these patterns, these nodes, who is it that you need to really support and all? And so you have gatekeepers, those are people who can influence the flow. Liaisons, the node that can connect a bunch of different clicks. A bridge means that I'm connecting one click. Isolates mean that I have minimum connections. And finally, influencers are people who have multiple links. Now, in terms of social networks, the internet was not the first big one. The French actually created an internet type system, but it wasn't computer driven. It was actually telephone driven, and it was called Minitel. And the problem with Minitel is it was run by the French government. And so people felt like innovation was being stifled. So it was a star mesh pattern. And people were also concerned about things like trust, privacy, intimacy, and civility. Without those 4 elements, you cannot have a network that's going to grow, because you need those elements. Without those elements, like if you didn't have privacy, this is where Facebook is starting to run into problems. This is going to be really interesting to see what happens. But the one thing Facebook does have is intimacy and trust among the users between each other. Also, civility. I'm thinking about dropping Facebook because everybody I know, all they do is get on Facebook and talk about politics. Now, I love politics. I mean, I will talk about it all the time, but I don't want it all the time. I mean, you want a break from these things. Anyway, so there's something called a limit of how many people you can know, and it's called Dunbar's number, and it's actually called the rule of 150, that anybody within a network can know 150 members. This comes from anthropological studies, in evolutionary psychology, And it also supports the belief that basically only 5 to 7 degrees of freedom separate any person from any other person in the globe. This is part of the reason why I think it's a squad in the military or something like that. That they keep that excuse me, a captain will basically command a group of about 150 people, and they keep it at 150 specifically for that reason. For those of you who have ever been in small companies, you feel like you know everybody in the company, and then when you get above 150, now you feel like you're in part of a large company. In terms of limits of clusters, there is something called the Dryden theory of corporate governance. And what this is that in the major corporations, it's actually easy to get influence because only 5 people really run the whole show. And the reason why that takes place is because of the hierarchical nature of corporations. That outside of these 5 people, everybody else comes down. And Jennifer Dryden was actually someone I went to business school with. And she worked for Disney. She was a high-level manager at Disney, and she actually knew Michael Eisner and a lot of the other people. And she said, oh, corporations are easy. You just need to know 5 people. You could influence everyone. And then I told her, Jen, what if you're an introvert? Like myself. It's like, what do you do? And so that's why I've always liked little companies, because little companies, it tends to be less about communication, more about the merit of what you're doing. And so in a little company, when somebody isn't rowing the boat, everybody knows it. Here are some of the measures in social networks. What kind of reach do you have? The degree, meaning how many segments does it take me to reach someone else? Do I have holes, meaning is there a way that I'm not connecting from one link to another? And are there things like structural equivalence? And the thing you start to see is that there are patterns that go over and over again. It's a little like statistics. In statistics, they tell you get 200 samples. And the reason why is when you get more than 200 samples, they tend to start to just repeat themselves. And so 200 is a good sample size. For those of you who do simulation, when you run 10,000 simulations versus 20,000 simulations, your curve looks pretty much the same. Betweenness, that's how many people exist between you and someone else. Closeness is the distance. Again, distance can be measured a lot of different ways. Radiality, and that's how novel information do you provide and goes out, and also cohesion, and that's how strongly people are connected to each other. So when you want to evaluate how good your social network is, here are the parameters that you look at. There's also density, integration, clustering coefficient, constant constraint centrality. You can just read all this on your own. There's nothing really special to talk about. But they are measures of how everybody connects. Global level density is you compared to everybody else. Eigenvector centrality, yeah, I get into all the definitions on this one. It measures how important is that node, and that's the eigenvector. And so what it all comes down to, all these definitions and everything, in terms of nodes, what's the size of that node? And is it transitional or is it the center of something? How is it linked to everything else, and how is that network formed? So everything we've talked about up to this point is concerned with structure and talks about these things. Now, what is critical mass? And that's that when the activity level is self-sustaining, and this is called positive feedback, and that's that what happens is that people are happy, they're engaged, and so they tell other people and bring other people into the network, and then you don't have to do any more work because the mass starts working on its own. And so the average of connections people have is about 130. And so the thing is, friendships in terms of relationships are only about 10 to 15%. And so actually they found out with Facebook, if you have 130 friends, they leave about 6 comments a day. And so the critical point of where you see critical mass taking place is around 10 to 15%. That if you have 10 to 15% of constant activity in the size of your network, then that's typically when you start getting feed forward. The thing is, you could think of your segments as being like buckets. And so, naturally, if you say, oh, my segment's going to be the United States of America, when you start talking about 10 or 15%, now you're talking about you have to have 45 million people active on your network. Yeah, that's kind of hard to do. And so, you want to start looking at smaller markets, smaller segments, these so-called buckets. And then once you get as much activity as you can in one bucket, then you have to go get another bucket, and so on and so forth. And so this starts getting into your target market, your serviceable market, and your addressable market. And so what they typically say is that revenue over time is you hit that knee and then you take off and woohoo, you can make all kinds of money. In reality, what it more looks like is this. You get ripples. And the reason why you get ripples is because in order to grow, you need to bring on more buckets. And so it's almost kind of like digital. And so you get this ripple effect of growth. In terms of filling the bucket, it's a lot like a real physical network. And that's you care about bandwidth, what's the capacity that you can move, how fast you can move it, and how efficiently. And that's for the amount of energy that you put into the system, how much you're getting out. So you're concerned about time, frequency, how often people are. What's the latency? And latency is, once I have an effect, how long do I have to wait to see something actually happen? A lot of times people have promotions. They go, oh my God, this is a disaster. Nobody's doing anything. But then all of a sudden, a week later, whoosh, things start to take off. It takes time for people to talk, and they also evaluate it. What's the efficiency according to your structure, and what's the incremental cost? And that's that naturally over time, your cost should be going down because you should be getting this positive feedback effect where you don't have to do the work. In terms of maintaining a network, what do people want? Good content. They want to see people active on it. They want to see frequency. And also that you have a high enough mass level. And what they found in networks is whoever can reach scale first has the best chance of controlling the network. And that's why you have all this hyper spending going on out there, such as in Twitter and